My husband looked me in the eye and said, "I'm in love with your sister, and I'm not sorry." Then he drained our account down to $11 and walked out the door. I spent that night on a bench outside a 24-hour diner, and that was the exact night a stranger called to tell me my estranged father had died and left me an empire he never let me see while he was alive. Welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. I want to tell you about a version of myself that no longer exists. Her name was Elena Reyes Whitfield, and she lived in a narrow blue Victorian in Portland, Oregon, 3 blocks from a bakery that sold cinnamon rolls the size of a dinner plate. She was 38. She was a structural architect at a mid-sized firm. Downtown, the kind of job where you spend your days making sure buildings don't fall down and nobody ever thanks you for it. She drove a gray Subaru with a dented bumper she never got around to fixing. She read historical fiction on the light rail. She called her mother every Sunday at exactly 4 o'clock. Her life, if you'd looked at it from the outside, was quiet in a way that felt earned rather than empty. That woman was me, before everything that I'm about to tell you happened. I met my husband, Marcus Whitfield, at a continuing education seminar on seismic retrofitting, which is not a romantic origin story, but it worked for us. He was a structural engineer, sharp-jawed, quick with a joke, the kind of man who remembered the names of waiters and asked follow-up questions, like he actually cared about the answers. We dated for 2 years, married for 9. We had a golden retriever named Cobalt, who slept diagonally across our bed, no matter how many times we tried to train him out of it. We had a joint savings account we called the Someday Fund, built dollar by dollar for a decade, meant for a cabin on the Oregon coast we'd been dreaming about since our honeymoon in Cannon Beach. I want you to hold on to that image for a moment, because it matters later. My younger sister, Priya, was 4 years my junior, and she had always been the one people noticed first. It wasn't jealousy on my part, and that matters later. It was simply a fact of the room. Priya had our mother's dark, deliberate eyes and a way of laughing that made strangers turn their heads. She'd gone through a brutal divorce 18 months before any of this started, and Marcus, ever the generous one, suggested she move into our guest room while she rebuilt her life. I said yes, immediately. Of course I did. She was my sister. That was in the spring. The first thing I noticed, though I didn't let myself notice it properly, was in early summer. A Thursday, I'd left the office early because a client meeting got pushed, and I came home to find them in the kitchen laughing over something on Priya's phone, standing closer than the moment required. When I walked in, the laughter clipped off half a beat too fast. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that for months. In July, Marcus started taking work calls in the garage with the door shut, something he'd never once done in 9 years of marriage. In August, his phone began living face down on every surface it touched. In September, he stopped reaching for my hand in the car, a habit so old I'd stopped noticing it existed until it was gone. None of these things, on their own, meant anything. Together, they formed a shape I refused to look directly at. Priya, for her part, grew strangely formal with me that summer. She complimented my cooking with a specific, rehearsed warmth. She hugged me a beat too long at the door. Every woman I've talked to since who lived through this tells me the same thing. Some part of her already knew. I knew, too. By the middle of October, the Someday Fund held $51,600. 10 years of careful saving. My salary, his consulting income, money we never touched because we were disciplined, supposedly building something together. I remember the night it ended with unusual clarity. It was a Tuesday in late October, unseasonably warm, the kind of Portland evening where the sky holds on to light a little longer than it should. I'd made risotto. The table was set with the good napkins, the ones we used maybe 4 times a year. Marcus came in from the garage, where he claimed to have been on a call with a client, and sat across from me with his hands folded like a man, about to deliver a quarterly report. He looked directly at me. That was the part that stayed with me longest. "Elena," he said, "I'm in love with Priya. I have been for a while. I'm done pretending otherwise. Outside, eh?" Neighbor's sprinkler ticked on and off. Cobalt was asleep by the back door. "We're happy," he continued as if happiness were a legal defense. "I know this hurts. I'm not going to apologize for finally being honest with you." I didn't cry. Some distant, furious part of me considered throwing the risotto. I sat very still and pressed my palm flat against the table, feeling the grain of the wood under my fingers, grounding myself in something solid because the rest of my world had just come apart at the seams. I asked him to leave. He already had a bag packed in the hall closet. Priya's things were already gone from the guest room. This had been planned in a way that meant every dinner I'd made that month, every conversation I thought was ordinary, had been staged around a decision I wasn't part of. I sat in that kitchen until almost midnight before I thought to check the Someday fund on my phone. The balance read $11.04, not zero. I understood immediately that the $11 was deliberate, a small, cruel flourish meant to say asterisk, I thought about you enough to leave you something, but not enough to leave you anything that mattered. Asterisk, I couldn't make myself stay in that house. I got in my car and drove without a destination in mind, ending up in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner off Sandy Boulevard, the kind of place with a buzzing sign and truckers eating alone at the counter. I sat in my car and watched moths batter themselves against the neon glow of the window and thought, over and over, what do I do now? My phone rang. An unfamiliar number, a Salem area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. I answered on the last ring, the way you answer things you know you're not ready for. Is this Elena Reyes-Whitfield? A man's voice, unhurried, professional, the cadence of someone who delivers difficult news for a living. "This is Elena," I said, my voice flat with exhaustion. "Ms. Whitfield, my name is Desmond Cole. I'm a senior partner at Cole and Bright Estate Counsel. I'm calling regarding your father, Walter Reyes. I'm very sorry to tell you he passed away this evening. A stroke. It was quick, from what the hospital reported. My father, Walter Reyes, a man I hadn't spoken to in 7 years, who had walked out on our family when I was 17 and Priya was 13, who had built a second life somewhere north of Seattle in commercial real estate and timber holdings, who sent a card on my birthday for 2 years and then simply stopped, existing in my memory as something between a bruise and a rumor. "MS. Whitfield, are you there?" "Yes," I said. "I'm here. Your father left a will naming you as the sole beneficiary of his estate. Preliminary valuation puts the estate at approximately $118 million. I'd like to arrange a meeting at your earliest convenience. There are time-sensitive matters we need to discuss." I sat in that parking lot a long time after the call ended. The arithmetic of that single night refused to sit. Still in my mind, $11 in my account, $118 million in a will I hadn't known existed. A husband gone, a sister who had taken him, a father who died alone and left everything to the daughter he'd spent 7 years pretending didn't exist. I slept in the car. That night, seat reclined, jacket balled up under my head, waking twice from the cold with no memory of where I was until the ache in my neck reminded me. A security guard tapped on my window around 5 in the morning and told me, not unkindly, that I couldn't stay there. I drove home with my face tight and swollen from crying I didn't remember doing. The house looked smaller in the gray morning light, the way places do after something enormous happens inside them. I walked through the rooms doing an inventory, the way you check for damage after a storm. His side of the closet empty, his toothbrush gone, his laptop, and the camera we bought for our 5th anniversary gone. But the mortgage was still in both our names. The Subaru was mine. And the joint account, I called the bank. The moment they opened and requested a full transaction history going back 30 days. What I found made my stomach drop in a slow, sickening way. He'd been moving money for 16 days. Small transfers, 800 here, 1,400 there. Nothing large enough to trip an automated fraud alert, nothing that would have caught my eye if I'd happened to glance at the account. 16 days of quiet, calculated withdrawal. I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and made 3 columns, the way I used to organize a report at work. Column 1, what I had lost. Column 2, what remained. Column 3, what I still needed to find out. Column 2 was the one that stopped me cold. I still had the house, temporarily. I still had my job. I still had my name on the car. And, absurdly, given the night I'd just survived, I had a pending inheritance of $118 million from a father who had been a stranger to me for the better part of a decade. I also had, though it took me longer to name it, my composure. Marcus had counted on me falling apart. I could see it in the timing of everything. The bag packed in advance. The money moved before he said a word. The $11 left as a message. He had built the entire architecture of my collapse with great care. What he hadn't accounted for was that I'd spent 9 years as an engineer watching him and men like him solve problems for a living, listening to the vocabulary of load calculations and failure points and margins of safety. I understood more about how systems break and how you reinforce them than either of them realized. I called my closest friend the next morning, a paralegal named Sophie Chun who worked at a downtown family law firm, and had the rare gift of holding both the emotional and legal weight of a situation without flinching from either. She arrived within the hour with coffee and her own legal pad, and did not hug me and tell me she was sorry, which I had been dreading. She looked at the transaction printout, exhaled slowly through her nose, and said, "Okay, this is financial misconduct in anticipation of divorce. We document everything, and we move fast." Something in me steadied at that sentence in a way I still can't fully explain. I want to be honest, I was afraid of the legal process, of confronting them, of the scale of the money now tangled up in my life. But fear, I was learning, doesn't have to be a stopping point. It can be the start of a plan instead. I had 2 calls to make that day. One to Desmond Cole, to understand exactly what I stood to inherit and on what timeline. One to a divorce attorney. I made both before lunch. My initial plan was simple. Say nothing to Marcus or Priya about the inheritance. Let them believe the $11 was the whole story. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let someone underestimate exactly how much you have left to work with. Desmond Cole's office occupied the 11th floor of a glass tower overlooking the Willamette River, the kind of space that communicates old money without a single raised voice. Dark walnut shelving. A receptionist who offered sparkling water in real glass. I arrived on a Friday morning in the one blazer I owned that still fit properly, my legal pad in my bag, my face arranged into something I hoped read as composed. Desmond was in his late 50s, silver at the temples, reading glasses perched low on his nose, and he carried himself with the unhurried precision of a man who had delivered life-altering news often enough to respect its weight. He walked me through my father's estate methodically. Walter Reyes had built his fortune primarily in Pacific Northwest timberland and a scattered portfolio of commercial properties across Washington and Oregon, too. Office complexes in Bellevue, a stake in a regional shipping terminal, and a series of private investments that had quietly compounded for 2 decades. The will had been revised 14 months earlier. Desmond showed me the date, without my asking, and I understood immediately why it mattered. My father had known he was sick. He'd been managing a heart condition for over a year, and he had spent that year putting his affairs into precise, deliberate order. He had left everything to me, not split with Priya. Me, specifically, by name, with a note attached that Desmond said I wasn't obligated to read but was welcome to. I read it anyway, standing right there in his office. Elena, I know I forfeited any right to your forgiveness a long time ago. I spent too many years being a coward and not enough being your father. I don't expect this to feel like an apology because I know money can't be won. I think I convinced myself you didn't need me, and I used that as permission to disappear. I was wrong about that, and about almost everything else. I'm sorry it took dying for me to say so. I folded the letter, put it in my bag, and did not cry in Desmond Cole's office, though it cost me something to manage it. The practical matters were straightforward. The estate would move through Washington probate, which Desmond estimated at 4 to 6 months given its complexity. In the meantime, I was named executor, which gave me administrative access to the estate's documents and, critically, the authority to retain counsel on the estate's behalf. Desmond's firm would handle probate. For the divorce, Sophie referred me to a woman named Diane Foster, a family law attorney with a reputation for being quietly ruthless in exactly the way I needed. Diane was in her early 50s, with the calm, efficient intensity of someone who had seen every possible version of the story and still hadn't run out of outrage on her client's behalf. She reviewed the bank transaction history within 2 days and called me with a single word I'd been waiting to hear. Actionable, she said. These transfers happened 16 days before he told you the marriage was over. Oregon is an equitable distribution state, and assets moved in anticipation of a divorce filing can be treated as dissipated marital property. We can pursue recovery. Can we get all of it back? We can build a compelling case, she said. But Elena, I need to ask you something directly. Do you have any documentation of the relationship between your husband and your sister? Timeline, messages, anything concrete? I told her I was working on it. That wasn't entirely true yet, but it would be true within the week. And here is where I want to be careful about exactly what I did, because I never once broke the law to get it. What I did was retrieve something that had always, technically, belonged to me. 3 years earlier, Marcus and I had set up a shared cloud subscription for household records, insurance, documents, appliance warranties, tax files, the unglamorous paperwork of a shared life. He'd forgotten it existed, or he'd assumed that in the chaos of leaving, I'd forget too. He was wrong on both counts. When I logged in, I found something neither of us had thought about in years, an old password manager we'd set up together on a lazy Sunday afternoon to keep track of shared logins for streaming services and the electric company, and which had, without either of us noticing, kept auto-saving new credentials every time one of us signed into something on a device still linked to that shared vault. Marcus had switched phones that spring. In the process, the messaging app he used for texting Priya, saved in his contacts under a name I recognized as an old college roommate, had briefly synced its backup through a cloud drive still tethered to our shared account before he caught the error, and disconnected it 3 weeks later. 3 weeks was enough. I sat at the kitchen table with the lights off, because somehow the dark felt like the only appropriate setting, and read messages spanning a window from the previous December through late February. What I'd assumed was a few reckless months had, in fact, been the better part of a year. In one message from January, Marcus had written, I told her she can stay as long as she needs. She has no idea. Priya's reply, I feel awful about it and also I don't. Is that insane? It wasn't insane. It made a terrible kind of sense. I forwarded the relevant screenshots to Diane Foster with a short note. Asterisk, this is your timeline documentation. Asterisk, then I closed the laptop and sat in the dark a long while longer. I was past pretending this might resolve itself quietly. The evidence was real. The legal process was underway. I had retained counsel for both the estate and the divorce. I had documented the financial misconduct in detail. I had crossed some invisible line from a woman something had happened to into a woman actively shaping. What happened next? There was no walking that back, and for the first time since the Tuesday with the risotto going cold on the table, I found I didn't want to. Diane filed the initial divorce petition on a Monday morning in early November, 3 weeks after that first call. In the diner parking lot. Divorce filings are public record in Oregon, and I knew Marcus had a standing search alert on his own name from years of monitoring his professional reputation online. Even knowing the discovery was inevitable, I wasn't prepared for how fast the retaliation came. He called at 4:40 that afternoon, no greeting. His voice pulled tight in a register I'd never once heard from him in 9 years of marriage. You actually filed? After everything? After everything, I said. Yes. This is insane, Elena. We can talk like adults. Come by. Priya's place. Just the three of us, no lawyers. I'd rehearsed this exact moment with Diane the day before. My attorney has advised me against unmediated conversations about the case, I said, keeping my voice level. Please, direct anything further to Diane Foster's office. He hung up without another word. Priya called 19 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail. The message ran almost 7 minutes long, which told me something on its own about the state she was in. I transcribed the relevant portions and sent them to Diane, since anything either of them said might speak to their awareness of the financial misconduct. The real escalation came 4 days after that. I was at a hardware store on a Saturday, of all the mundane places, standing in the paint aisle comparing swatches for a bathroom I'd been meaning to repaint for 2 years, when I turned around and found Marcus 6 feet away, wearing the fixed expression of a man delivering a rehearsed line. I know about the inheritance, he said. The floor seemed to tilt under me. I hadn't told anyone outside Sophie, Diane, and Desmond Cole. I don't know what you're talking about, I said. Your father's estate. $118 million. He said the figure quietly, almost conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather. Elena, we were married 9 years. Under Oregon law, marital assets acquired during the I know Oregon family law. I cut in. My attorney knows it better. It would be in everyone's interest to let her handle this before things get complicated, he said, and there it was 9 years of marriage reduced to a negotiating position. I'm aware of your interest, I told him. Directed to Diane Foster's office. I left the paint swatches on the shelf and walked out. My hands shook the whole drive home, not purely from fear, but from the tremor that comes when adrenaline has nowhere left to go. The question that stayed with me was how he'd found out so quickly, since the probate filing wasn't yet searchable. Either someone at Desmond's office had been careless, or, more likely, Priya had heard about my father's death through a mutual acquaintance and put the pieces together faster than I'd expected. I called Diane from the parking lot. He knows about the inheritance, I said. About the money, or about the evidence? The money. He approached me in person. That's a problem for him, not for you, Diane said, with a flatness I found deeply reassuring. Inheritances are separate property in Oregon, even during an active marriage. He has no legal claim to it, and him approaching you directly after a petition has been filed is itself a violation of the process. I'm noting it for the record. Any witnesses? I hadn't thought to check, but the hardware store had security cameras over every aisle. Diane sent a formal cease and desist to Marcus's newly Retained attorney that week. 2 days later, his attorney responded, aggressive, accusatory, claiming my petition was retaliatory, that the transfers had happened with my implicit knowledge, and burying, in the third paragraph, a vague threat about documentary evidence regarding my own conduct during the marriage that might be relevant to A. Character assessment. It was a bluff. I'd been faithful for 9 years, if anything too devoted, too willing to explain away every warning sign as something ordinary. But the threat still left me cold for the better part of an hour. Diane filed a response 2 days later, citing the relevant statute along with 3 supporting precedents, and the counter-motion to include the inheritance in the marital estate was denied a little over 2 weeks after. That was when the direct pressure stopped, not because they'd given up, I understood, but because they'd tested the structure I'd built and found it holding and needed time to regroup. I took 5 days off and drove to a rented cabin near Manzanita on the Oregon coast, close enough to hear the water at night without seeing it. I walked the beach every morning, read 2 novels I barely remembered afterward, and slept 9 hours a night for the first time since October. On the last morning, sitting on the porch steps, with coffee going cold in my hands, I thought about my father, a coward for most of his life, and then, at the very end, a man trying in the only way left to him to make something right. I thought about what if anything I owed him. I decided I was going to be fine, not because of the money waiting in probate, but because I was still standing, still thinking clearly, still capable of making a plan and following it through. The next approach was kindness, which turned out to be more unsettling than the confrontation in the hardware store had been. It was a Saturday afternoon in mid-November, 2 weeks after I'd come back from the coast, and I was in the backyard, pulling the last of the dead marigolds out of the bed along the fence when my phone rang. Priya's name on the screen. I stood there with dirt under my fingernails and let it ring twice before answering. Elena! Her voice was soft, the version of her I remembered from childhood, before whatever this year had made her into. I just wanted to hear your voice. I've been thinking about you constantly. Okay, I said. I know. You're angry, and you have every right to be. I'm not calling to fight. I'm calling because you're my sister and I miss you, and I don't want this to destroy our family any more than it already has. Priya! I said, please. Don't. A pause. Don't what? Don't call me, and use the soft voice, and tell me you miss me the same week his attorney sends a letter implying I have character problems. Don't do the gentle version if the strategy hasn't actually changed. Another pause, longer this time. This isn't a strategy, Elena. I mean it. I believe you mean it in this exact moment, I said. I also think you're calling me the same week. You two have been coordinating a legal response, and I think those 2 things are connected whether you intend them to be or not. I'm going to go back to my garden now, and I'm going to ask you to communicate through the process we've both agreed to. I hung up. I stood there with my gloves still on, the late afternoon light going gold through the maple at the back fence, and I felt precisely almost nothing. Not the cold nothing of shock, but the clean nothing of someone who has moved past the place where that particular pain can still land. The call didn't make me reconsider or miss her the way I once would have. It made me sad in the removed way you feel about something already done, and that told me something important about how far I'd come. Marcus sent a text the following Thursday, not about the divorce, at least not directly. He asked if I still had an external hard drive he'd use for job site photos, since a client needed the files. It was such an ordinary request, so precisely calibrated to trigger the old reflexes of a shared life, that for 3 full seconds I almost just answered it the way I would have a year earlier. No, I haven't seen it. Did you check the garage shelf? Then I read it again and forwarded it straight to Diane as potential harassment. Technically permitted, she confirmed, practically unwise on his part. I'm logging it. I think, looking back, they expected me to be inconsistent, furious one week, tearful and pliable the next. That's what falling apart looks like from the outside, and it's clearly what they'd planned for. Instead, what they got week over week was a woman who was becoming more settled in her purpose, not harder exactly, but steadier. The support I found that autumn wasn't what I expected going in. Sophie remained my anchor, practical, sharp, the kind of friend who sat across from me and helped me think instead of simply agreeing with whatever I said. But Diane also mentioned, almost in passing at the end of one appointment, a Thursday evening group that met at a community center on the east side, organized by a family counseling nonprofit for women navigating contested divorces and estate disputes. Not therapy exactly, more like a room where you could speak without performing for anyone. I went once, certain I'd hate it. I went back the next 4 Thursdays in a row. There was a woman named Renata, 60-something, who'd survived a brutal contested inheritance fight with her brothers and come out the other side with both her sanity and her share intact. She had a way of listening that made you feel simultaneously seen and less alone in the specific absurdity of your own situation. There was a younger woman, Bethany, tangled in a custody dispute so complicated it made mine look almost simple by comparison, who nonetheless laughed easily and often. The thing they're counting on, Renata said one evening, to the room in general but landing squarely on me, is that you'll wear yourself out trying to understand why they did it. At some point you stop asking why and start asking what's next. I wrote that on a napkin and kept it in my wallet for months. It wasn't that the betrayal stopped mattering to me. I still carried it and suspect I always will. But I stopped letting the question of why occupy the space that needed to be occupied by what do I do about it? That shift was quiet, and it happened gradually, and it was, I think, the most important thing that happened to me that entire fall. They showed up at the house, uninvited on a Sunday in early December. I hadn't been warned. I pulled into my own driveway at 2 in the afternoon, returning from the grocery store, and found Marcus's silver sedan parked at the curb with both of them inside it. They got out as I turned off the engine. Priya was wearing a camel coat I'd never seen before. Marcus wore the navy jacket he always reached for when he wanted to project reasonableness. I sat in my car a moment before getting out and texted Sophie, they're outside my house. Going to talk to them. Logging the time. Her reply came back fast. Stay outside. Stay visible. Call me if anything escalates. I got out. We should talk, Marcus said. No greeting, hands in his jacket pockets in that stance that manages to look casual and defensive at once. Just the 3 of us, privately. We're outside, I said. This is about as private as it's going to get. Priya stepped forward. She'd clearly been crying recently, the particular redness around her eyes I recognized from 100 childhood arguments. Elena, please. Can't this just be over? We're destroying each other. The petition was filed a month ago, I said. Your attorney is in communication with mine. There's a process and we're in it. The process, Marcus said, his tone shifting, the way temperature drops before affront, moves in, that you're funding with an inheritance from a man who abandoned both of you. I don't need your opinion on my father, I said. I think it's convenient, he continued, as though I hadn't spoken, that suddenly you have unlimited legal resources and you're playing this hard when 6 months ago you were. What do you want? I asked, cutting him off, keeping my voice flat. He looked at me for a beat, visibly recalibrating, the aggression dropping back down into the reasonable register he'd clearly rehearsed on the drive over. I want us to settle privately, he said. I'm not asking for anything tied to your inheritance. I understand the law on that. I'm asking for a fair split of the marital assets, and some acknowledgement that this wasn't entirely one-sided. You moved $51,000 out of our joint account over 16 days, I said. My attorney has full documentation. That money represented years of proportional contributions from both of us. He started, then stopped, restarted. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Diane Foster is aware of your interpretation. Your attorney is welcome to discuss it with her directly. Priya moved then, the way she used to when we were kids, and wanted something she wasn't willing to ask for outright. A slight step sideways, a softening of posture. Elena, I know I hurt you. I know there's nothing I can say that makes it okay. But we're sisters. We grew up in the same house. Mom is still alive. Are we really going to do courtrooms and attorneys for years over a man? I'll give her this. It was well aimed, because part of it was true. We had grown up together. I'd sat with her through every version of heartbreak she'd ever had before this. There was real history there, and she was leaning on it the way a lockpick leans on the weak point in a lock. Not breaking anything outright, just applying pressure exactly where it would do the most work. Priya, I said, I love you. I need you to hear that clearly. I love you, and I am devastated by what happened. But what you're asking me to do is let Marcus keep money he took illegally, abandon a legal process that is working exactly the way it's supposed to, and do it because you're reminding me we're family. That isn't a compromise. That's surrender wearing a nicer coat. She blinked, and Marcus's jaw tightened visibly. This isn't who you are, he said, his voice cracking at the edge. You don't weaponize lawyers. You don't play games with money. That's not. I'm someone whose husband stole from her and whose sister helped him plan it, I said. I'm someone who is now using the legal system exactly the way it exists to be used. I'm sorry if that doesn't match the version of me you were counting on. There was a long pause, 10 or 15 seconds that felt almost architectural in weight. You'll regret this, Marcus said finally, not quite a threat, more the flat statement of a man who'd run out of leverage, and hadn't yet accepted it. They left. I went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and let myself shake for a few minutes, because the adrenaline had to land somewhere. My hands were cold, my throat tight, but underneath all of it, I knew exactly what I was protecting, and exactly why, more clearly than I had in weeks. The mediation session was scheduled for a Wednesday in January at a neutral attorney's office downtown, a required step before any court date under Oregon's guidelines for contested divorces. I arrived 12 minutes early. Diane was already there, her leather folder open, a document I hadn't seen in its final form resting on top, though I'd reviewed a draft the night before until nearly 1 in the morning. Marcus arrived with his own attorney, a man named Reggie Hartwell, who had the practiced friendliness of someone accustomed to running a room. He shook the mediator's hand, nodded politely to Diane, and looked past me for a half-second as though I were a line item to be accounted for rather than a person in the room. Priya wasn't there. She had no formal role in the divorce proceedings, but I knew, the way you know things about people you've spent your whole life reading, that she'd spent the previous evening on the phone with Marcus, walking through whatever strategy his attorney had assembled. We sat down. The mediator, a composed woman named Colette, laid out the agenda, the $51,600 in transferred marital funds, the valuation of the house, and a counterclaim from Marcus's side, amended twice already, arguing that my supposed emotional withdrawal during the marriage had contributed to its breakdown and should factor into the asset split. Diane let Colette finish before opening her folder. We'd like to enter several items into the mediation record, she said, in the tone of someone reading a routine grocery list. First, the full bank transaction history documenting 16 days of transfers from the joint account prior to separation, totaling $51,600. Second, a sworn statement from the bank's compliance division confirming those transfers were executed unilaterally by Marcus Whitfield without co-authorization. Third, we've reviewed the bank records already, Reggie interjected. Third, Diane continued, without a flicker of change in her tone, message documentation lawfully retrieved from a shared cloud backup account, establishing that the relationship between Marcus Whitfield and Priya Reyes began no later than the previous December, 11 months prior to the separation and roughly 2 months before Priya Reyes moved into the marital home. The room went quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet before. I watched Marcus's face carefully. I'd wondered, in the weeks leading up to this, how it would feel to sit across from him like this, whether it would be grief or fury or the old undertow of familiarity. What I actually felt was clarity, the exact sensation of looking at something in poor light for a long time and finally having someone switch on the lamp. He hadn't known about the cloud backup. I watched the color shift along his jaw as the realization landed. Fourth, Diane said, financial records obtained through discovery showing that $14,000 of the transferred marital funds were deposited into an account belonging to Priya Reyes within a month of the transfer. We have the deposit records. That part one hadn't known either. Diane had obtained it through discovery and held it back until the documentation was airtight before telling me. He had funneled $14,000 of our savings, our decade, of dollar-by-dollar discipline, directly into my sister's account. Reggie leaned toward Marcus, and they exchanged a low, rapid conversation the mediator politely ignored. Ms. Whitfield, Colette said, turning to me, would you like to address any of this? I would, I said. I'd prepared a written statement 3 nights earlier, revised it twice, read it aloud to Sophie, who'd suggested one change. When the moment actually arrived, I set the paper aside and spoke without it. Marcus, I spent 9 years building a life with you. I was faithful and present and, if anything, too willing to trust you. You had a relationship with my sister for close to a year while she was living in our home. You systematically moved money out of our joint account in the days before you told me the marriage was over, and some of that money went directly to her. I think you believed I'd be too devastated, or too disorganized, or too financially depleted to respond with any coherence. I want the $51,600 returned in full. I want the house, which I'll either buy out at a fair valuation or sell with an equitable split. I want the counterclaim about my emotional conduct withdrawn because it's both false and deeply insulting. And I want this finished. Reggie started to respond. Diane raised one finger, small and precise, and said, you should also be aware that if this message evidence is entered into court proceedings, it establishes a pattern directly relevant to a dissipation claim under Oregon's equitable distribution statute. Your client transferred marital funds during an active affair directly into the account of the person involved. That's about as textbook a dissipation case as the state sees. Our position is fully documented, and we're prepared to take it in front of a judge if necessary. Reggie asked for a recess. They were gone for nearly 25 minutes. When they returned, Marcus had the look of a man who finally understood the full shape of what had happened to him, not because it had been done to him, exactly, but because he'd built a structure out of a string of bad decisions and was now standing inside it as the whole thing came down around him. He agreed to every term on the table. I signed. Nothing that day. Diane wanted a formal settlement agreement drafted before either of us put a signature on anything. But I walked out of that conference room into a cold, clear January afternoon, stood on the sidewalk, and breathed an air that felt sharper than usual. It wasn't triumph, exactly. It was something quieter than that. The specific satisfaction of a difficult thing finally completely finished. The settlement was finalized on a Tuesday in late February, weak winter sunlight coming through the tall windows of Diane's office. I signed my name to a document that represented the legal conclusion of 9 years of marriage and 4 months of what I can only describe as the hardest sustained work I've ever done. The terms, Marcus, return the full $51,600 wired to my sole account within 10 business days. The house would be listed and sold, proceeds split 60-40 in my favor based on Diane's successful argument. Regarding the dissipated funds, the counterclaim about my emotional conduct was withdrawn without prejudice, which is the legal profession's polite way of saying it simply disappeared from the record. The divorce itself was granted on the standard grounds of irreconcilable differences. Diane shook my hand as I stood to leave. She wasn't the type to editorialize, but she said, "You were a good client. You stayed rational when it counted. I had good counsel." I told her. Desmond Cole's office had been working in parallel through those same months. The probate process, originally estimated at 4 to 6 months, moved efficiently thanks to how meticulously my father had organized his affairs. Before he died, his final gift, in a strange way, whatever else he'd failed to give me while he was alive. In April, 6 months after that first call outside the diner, the estate cleared probate. The final figure came to $121,300,000, higher than the initial estimate because one of the Bellevue office properties, appraised conservatively at the outset, sold to a regional developer at a premium. I sat with Desmond that April afternoon as he walked me through the transfer documents with the same careful, unhurried precision he'd shown from our first meeting, and I understood slowly that this was real. My father, flawed, absent, cowardly for most of his life, and then at the end, quietly desperate to make amends, had left me something that gave me the freedom to choose every next step of my life without constraint. I'd spent the months of probate working with a financial advisor Desmond recommended, a woman named Harriet Boyle, who had the rare skill of explaining complex financial instruments without condescension. I want to be clear, I didn't become someone else overnight. I didn't buy a yacht or move into a penthouse downtown. What I did was resign from my position at the architecture firm that June, with genuine gratitude for 11 years. There, and an equally genuine sense that it was time to step outside the life that had been built entirely around necessity. I established a scholarship and mentorship fund in my father's name, the Reyes Foundation for Applied Sciences, aimed at funding engineering and architecture education for first-generation college students across Oregon and Washington. It felt like the right use for a complicated inheritance, a way of turning something built on regret into something that might actually do good going forward. I bought a house, smaller than people probably expected, a restored craftsman bungalow in Portland's Alberta Arts District, 4 blocks from a coffee shop I'd always liked, with an overgrown garden in the back that needed real work. Cobalt ran through every room on the first day, thoroughly confused and thoroughly delighted, claiming a sunny spot by the back window as his own. Within the hour, I wasn't present when Marcus finally understood the full scope of what his choices had cost him. I didn't need to be, but Sophie, who has always had a talent for knowing things, told me he'd realized sometime around the settlement's finalization that his entire negotiating strategy had collapsed because he'd fundamentally misjudged who I was. He'd taken $51,000 from a woman he assumed would be too shattered to fight back, and that woman had retained sharp legal counsel and documented every single transaction with the same precision she used to calculate load-bearing tolerances at work. He'd also, somewhere in the chaos of that autumn, lost his job. His engineering firm carried a conflict of interest clause covering financial misconduct. Allegations and the discovery documents, once filed, weren't private. A colleague saw them, The firm opened an internal review. Marcus was let go that January, the same month we finalized the settlement. He and Priya were, last I heard, sharing a 2-bedroom rental out near Gresham. She hadn't found steady work. Their relationship, which had felt urgent and necessary enough to justify everything they'd done to build it, was reportedly straining. Under the ordinary weight of consequences neither of them had planned for. I want to be honest, I didn't celebrate any of that when I heard it. I'm not built for satisfaction in other people's suffering, even earned suffering. What I felt instead was closer to a recognition of cause and effect. Every structure carries the weight of its foundation. Theirs had been unstable from the start, and now they were living inside it. The legal chapter was closed. The financial chapter was closed. I'd walked into that hardware store confrontation with shaking hands and walked out of mediation into a cold January afternoon with something solid settling into my chest for the first time in months. No compromises, no quiet acceptance of whatever they'd assumed I'd simply absorb. I was finished with that version of my own story, and I was ready to find out what the next one looked like. That first summer in the new house, I planted a garden of my own, not the hurried, half-hopeful kind I'd put in. At the old house, the one I'd been pulling up dead when Priya's call came through. This one I planned carefully. Over the winter, reading about native perennials with the same focus I used to bring to structural drawings. By June, the backyard of the bungalow was full of color. Lavender along the fence, a climbing clematis on a trellis. I'd built myself tomatoes in raised beds I ate warm off the vine most mornings. It was the small, unremarkable things that told me I'd actually changed. I slept well. I cooked without needing an occasion to justify it. I read on Sunday afternoons without the low hum of anxiety that had quietly been my baseline for more of my marriage than I'd ever let myself admit. I walked to the coffee shop most mornings, a place called Fernwood, and sat at the same corner table, reading or writing in a journal, and the simple act of doing nothing in particular felt, for the first time in years, like something I'd actually earned. The Reyes Foundation launched its first grant cycle that fall, distributing just over $2 million across 19 schools throughout Oregon and Washington, funding scholarships and hands-on engineering labs for students who otherwise wouldn't have had access to them. I sat on the board myself. Desmond Cole, it turned out, was an avid reader of exactly the kind of dense historical fiction I liked, and we discovered this over coffee after one board meeting and ended up talking for 40 minutes about a novel we both happened to read that same month. He was quiet, thoughtful, recently widowed, and we started having coffee together with a regularity that felt less like coincidence and more like something I was choosing on purpose. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't also, at times, still sad that year. Grief doesn't sort itself neatly once you're free of the thing that caused it. I grieved the marriage, or more precisely the future I'd assumed was coming with it. I grieved the sister who existed before she made the choice that made every choice after it feel inevitable. I called my mother more often, and she's 73 and as sharp as ever, told me simply, "I always thought you were the steady one. I'm glad you stayed that way." Sophie and I kept a standing dinner every other Thursday. Renata, from the support group, became a genuine, lasting friend, the kind of friendship that only forms between people who met during the hardest stretch of their lives. As for Marcus and Priya, the last real update I had came the following spring. He still hadn't found comparable work. Portland's engineering community is smaller and gossips more than people assume. He was picking up inconsistent consulting jobs on small residential projects. Priya had taken a retail job downtown. The Gresham apartment was not, by every account that reached me, a particularly happy place. There had been a public argument that spring, the kind that travels through mutual acquaintances, about money and about the quiet cruelty of having sacrificed a sister for something that turned out to be ordinary in exactly the ways neither of them had anticipated. When something is built on betrayal, it tends to carry the weakness of its own foundation forward. Priya called once, that April, and left a voicemail I listened to all the way through twice. She said she was sorry, and she said it in a way that sounded, as far as I could tell, like she meant it. I thought about calling her back for 3 days straight. Then I thought about the Sunday she and Marcus had shown up uninvited in my driveway, and about the message she'd sent him back in January. She has no idea. I didn't call back. Not because I was still nursing the wound, but because I'd come to understand that some bridges can't be rebuilt from just one side, and the choice of whether to try was entirely mine to make, on my own timeline if ever. The summer moved forward the way summers do when you're finally paying attention to them again. The garden came in, fuller than the year before. The foundations programs reached almost 6,000 students. Desmond and I had dinner at a restaurant neither of us had chosen for any strategic reason, which felt, quietly, like a small milestone. It was easy in the way things are easy when you're no longer performing for anyone, including yourself. I turned 39 that August and hosted a small dinner at the bungalow. Sophie, Renata, too, colleagues from the board, and my mother, who drove down from Salem and told me the garden was beautiful and cried briefly in the kitchen when she thought I wasn't looking. I put my arm around her, and we stood together at the window looking out at the lavender, catching the last of the evening light. Was that happiness? I think it was. The real version of it. Not the performed kind, but the kind that only arrives once you've been tested and found, to your own surprise, that you held. So I want to ask you something, because I genuinely want to know the answer. What would you have done in my place? Would you have settled quietly and let the grief swallow the rest of your life? Would you have signed up for the Thursday night group, hired the attorney, and planted the garden anyway? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, please share it with someone who might need it. Because somewhere out there, someone is sitting exactly where I once sat, in a car in the middle of the night, trying to figure out what comes next. Tell them something absolutely does. Thank you so much for watching, and for being here with me.